Okay, so we are now live. This is my first actual live stream, so I'm pretty excited. All right, so let's get into this right now. So what we have today is we are going to be covering taking notes, letters of recommendations for grad school, and then apps and software to boost productivity in school. And the reason we're going to do this is because I've been getting a lot of questions about people asking me about this. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Katkov. I am the founder of UofTearless.com, which is essentially a brand that helps students save more time and pretty much make school suck less. So I help you either study more efficiently or find better ways to do things outside of school. I can help you with navigating I guess like anything related to international students, because I went through that process myself. I'm from the US and I am now in Canada at the University of Toronto. But I do have to mention that UofTearless is in no way affiliated with the University of Toronto unless it is a specific event. So these are the live lessons is what I'm going to be calling this live stream. And so the first thing we're going to cover is taking notes. So the question that I got from this was, whenever somebody follows me on Instagram, they're prompted with me asking them if there's anything in particular that they want to see a video on. So this person says something about how to take notes properly. I know you made a video about it, but I feel like you could give good note structure. Okay, so let's get into this one right now. So starting with taking notes. I take notes in a way that is probably different than most of you. So I actually don't take very many notes. The reason for this is because most of my studying comes from flashcards. And so I want to optimize my notes to make it as easy as possible for me to make flashcards after lecture and not necessarily capture everything down, because a lot of the time I also make flashcards in lecture. This is very important. So if there were a slide, right? If there was a slide, and in most slides, you're going to have something along the lines of this, right? There's going to be a big title, and then there's going to be probably a bullet point with some stuff, and then another bullet point with some stuff, maybe an image here, or maybe another bullet point with some stuff, something like that, right? So, and then most of the rest of the lecture would just look like this, where you have more slides and you can just scroll down through them. And there's probably like an intro and also a summary slide. And the summary slide actually, that will also usually have a bunch of bullet points. Summary slide. So here, it's going to be like point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, blah, blah, blah. And these are pretty much just the main takeaways from whatever is going to be said in the lecture. So it's actually very important that you go to the summary slide. But first, let's talk about what are you going to do. You have a lecture coming up, right? And you just want to make sure that you take the absolute best notes possible. What do you do? Well, here's my approach. So first of all, it even starts before lecture. So the first thing you do is actually right here. And this is going to be mental priming. And in mental priming, the goal is to go through all of this, right? But you're going to go through it very fast because the professor is going to explain it to you in lecture, so you don't actually need to get all the details. But what is important is that you know what you're going to be learning, because not only does this allow you to know what to look for, but it also helps you categorize what is being said in the lecture, because think of it like building a house with no foundation, right? If you have nowhere to put the house, you're just putting the house on like a slab of, dirt, right? That's a pretty unstable house. There's no foundation there. And what happens if, the weather changes and that dirt starts washing away and all of a sudden your house starts crumbling, right? Because there's no cognitive structure to place all of the information. Your brain doesn't know where to put it. So it gets confused, and that's the problem. So mental priming is very important. What I would recommend for this, I'm going to touch on it in a little bit here. I'm going to touch on it very briefly here. But if you want a way more in-depth explanation of any of these things here, you can just go to UofTearless.com. I did make a whole, it's like a 30 video series, and it has just like a bazillion examples, and it'll tell you exactly how to do it. But for the purposes of this live stream, we want to keep things quick. We want to keep it brief. So mental priming, you're basically just going to go through the slides. After you go through the slides, or the first time you go through, you're literally just going to look at, so for round 1, you just want to look at, what do they look like? The look of the slides. Look of slides. The second time you go through, you're going to go through it 3 times. So the second time you go through, you're going to pick out all of the headers. And then on the third time around, you're going to look at all of the bolded words. And the bolded words, those are usually the words that, they're usually vocab words. They're things that you're probably going to need to memorize or to know, and just like, that's what you're going to be studying. So like, in other words, all of this is going to be explained by those bolded words. So they're going to be key terms, and then you're also going to know the headers. So that's going to be the topic of the slide. Sometimes the topics, they continue on for several slides. It's not just one slide. So that's essentially what you're going to be doing. So after mental priming, so these are the steps of mental priming right here, then you're actually going to go into lecture. So now that you have an idea of what you're going to be doing, right, what you're going to be learning, what the professor is going to be saying, now you are ready to plug in details right into the lecture. And so this is how we make sure not to overcomplicate the notes, because if you don't know what the professor is going to say, you're going to try to write everything the professor says. You're going to have way too much to write, and it's going to be really, really difficult to stay on track. So another thing that I also would like to mention, so we're just going to have rules of note-taking. And rule number 1 is that I never write by hand. You can see even now that it's slow. The reason I never write by hand is because I can't keep up with the pace of the lecture unless I type it, because they talk fast. And a lot of the time, it's all the information here isn't on the slides. It doesn't look as beautiful as that, right? Maybe it'll look like this without like a bunch of explanations, right? Especially for math courses or chemistry courses, there might just be like the problem, and then they'll go over the answer in class, but if you don't write that down, then you're not going to know what the answer is, right? So we want to make sure that we're not overcomplicating everything and just filling everything up with like a ton of, random notes, right? So you know what you want to do, right? You already know what to learn. Then the professor is going to start talking. They're going to fill in the details, and it's your job to make sure that you write down anything that's not on the slides. I would very much recommend that, so rule number 2 is that you always use the slides. Always use the slides. Why do this? I know some people like to just type it into a Google Doc. I know some people like to write it by hand. I know some people like to take pictures. This I would highly recommend you don't do, because let's be honest, anyone who takes pictures, you probably don't go back and look at it, right? I used to think that I was going to go back and look at it, but I almost never did. Like, probably I went back and looked on it if I remembered that it existed and it came up in a question and I couldn't understand what the question was. That would probably be the only time that I'd go back into my camera roll and look at a picture of a slide that I took in class. So I pretty much just forgot that it existed the moment that I took the picture. So always use the given slides if there are given slides, because it's going to save you a lot of time in writing your own notes. Okay, so now let's go back to here. What do you do here? Now let's say you have a nice slide, or you've written all of the stuff that the professor has said. how do you make this as efficient as possible so that your studying is as fast as possible and you can learn this as quickly as possible, right? So I'm going to give you two examples. One is the way I do it. The other one is the way that I recommend you do it if you don't make flashcards. So the first way, my way, is that I will go in and I will turn all of these bullet points right here, and this one, they're all going to be turned into flashcards. And this is, like, it takes a while to get fast enough to be able to make them flashcards. But with practice, I promise you can, and you can actually make them faster than the pace of the lecture a lot of the time. A lot of the time, I can do a 3-hour lecture in roughly 2 hours. So, that's another way that I can save a lot of time. And then I can kind of just like passively take in the background information that the professor's saying, and anything extra that they say, I can note, and I will write it down on the slide, right? That'll be my little note there. And then I will go through the slides again after lecture and just write, what the professor was saying. Okay, now, what do you do if you don't make flashcards? Because the flashcards, the reason I do that is so I can study right away. But what happens if you don't make flashcards, you don't know how to? And by the way, if you want to know the software that I use to make flashcards, it's called Anki, A-N-K-I. And it's essentially a free software that you can download on your computer. And what it does is it has a built-in algorithm that will essentially tell you which cards to study and when. And with this, you don't have to think about anything. You just study the cards that it assigns you, and after you do, you mess with the presets a little bit, but like you just basically study what it tells you, and then you will not forget it as long as you don't cheat yourself. So that's Anki. I highly recommend everybody get this. It's also way faster than writing everything by hand. If you don't have flashcards, or you don't make flashcards, here's what I recommend you do, because it's almost the same principle, except it might even be faster if you're just going through and not searching for the details, and you'll fill those in later with later studying. But what I would recommend is this. When you encounter a slide, so first of all, you know what the intro slide is, and you've already read the summary in your mental priming, and that would be like after the bolded words. So I guess step 4 here would be read the summary. Read summary. But let's take a slide like this one here. You clearly have a lot of information. You clearly have more than one point. So your job is to make it as easy as possible for you to remember what was said when you were in lecture, for you, the version of you that is later, that's after lecture. So what's the easiest way to do this? Well, you essentially are categorizing the slides. And the way that I found is the easiest way to do this is to just ask questions that have the points as answers. So what do I mean by this? What the heck is Simon talking about? Well, you have this here, right? So everything is going to fall under that category, right? That's the topic. That's the header of the slide. So your job is to make sure that you're asking questions that relate this to this and to this and to this. Let's look at an example. So say I had a slide that was, let's say this was like biology course. Biology. Okay. And we were talking about the mitochondria, or we were talking about organelles. And the types of organelles would be like mitochondria and what was it, like chloroplasts, I think. So, something like that, right? Okay. So in this even, you would have let's say there are two other bullet points here, right? You have energy and yeah, I mean, honestly, that's pretty much it, right? It's the powerhouse of the cell, right? So let's just say that it said powerhouse of cell. Okay, so now you can see that it's kind of in descending order, right? From the largest to the middle, and then to the lowest, the smallest subject. So your job now is to go down, right? And you can think of this as, let's say you had a mind map where this was the topic, the overarching topic, and then you went out one way, and this would be like the middle piece, so maybe like mitochondria, I'll say organelle 2, just to save time. To organelle 3, organelle 3. Okay, and then after this, you go out again, right? This is probably pretty obvious, but I'll make my point here in a second. So now you're going to have the little pieces of like the details. So detail 1 and detail 2. Okay, so you can very clearly see that if somebody were to ask you about the organelles, so this would be organelles, that all you have to do is just go boom and then boom, right? And also to here, when you're recalling the information. It makes it very simple. So I would probably write something like, what are the organelles and their functions? That would be the question that would give me the answers here. I would say, okay, well, mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and the chloroplasts, which honestly, I forget what they do. That looks really bad on me. I just know that they make the cell green if it's plants. So yeah, so basically that's the question. So what are the organelles of the cell? And you can even do variations of this. So animal versus plant. Animal/plant. Or that could be another question. You could say, how do the organelles of animals and plant cells vary? So what are the organelles of the cell and their functions? Okay, that's pretty simple. Now, I'm going to show you a really quick way that's going to help you memorize this, because I know a lot of you probably don't just want to know, like, okay, what questions do I ask, but like, how do I actually learn it, right? So this actually doesn't directly answer the question of taking notes, but it's definitely going to help you memorize your notes a little bit faster. So let's go into this because it's a pretty quick tip. First, let's say you wanted to know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Well, your brain stores information a lot better when it is images rather than words. So if I were to say the word spoon, you're probably thinking of this, right? A spoon. You're not thinking S-P-O-O-N, right? Nobody thinks about how to spell the word spoon when somebody just says spoon. You just know what it is. And so one of the reasons why AI has a lot of trouble defining things is because it's something called the grounding problem. So you can describe a spoon, right? You could say it's like, it has like a concave, large part at the top, and then it's like shiny and made of metal or sometimes plastic. But AI doesn't know what a spoon is, right? And so that's a huge advantage that we have, right? It can never hold a spoon, but we can experience a spoon. So that's one of the benefits, is that we can use visual encoding. So if I'm trying to remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, one easy way that I found to do this, and this is actually the same visual imagery that I use, is that the powerhouse of the cell is essentially the engine to a car. So if I had a car here, right, this is going to be a pretty terrible car, but here, and like this, we have some windows here. Okay, and then the front dash, and here we go. Okay. All right, that's not terrible. But now we have the engine, so the hood is going to be up here. And we're going to have a big block engine here. Okay. It's a fast car. Okay. So if this is the powerhouse of the cell, then that means it's the engine of a car. One way to include or strengthen how well you can memorize is to include more senses in whatever, in the information, in the encoding process. So if I'm not just seeing the words mitochondria here and the words powerhouse and the word cell, right? That's just like phonological encoding where you're just hearing it. If you were to see it, right? So now you have the mitochondria here, and that's the cell, so you know it's in a cell. It's a little bit better, but it's not the best. Here, we have the engine to a car. Well, we've definitely experienced a car a lot more than you've experienced just one cell. Not many people have looked through a microscope and experienced one cell, right? Maybe if you're in a biology class, right? But like just for the vast majority of people, and also just like in terms of commonality, right? A car is much more common than looking through a microscope to see a cell. So this is going to be an easier image to remember. Now, to include more senses in this, we want to make it vivid and we want to make it salient. Salient means it grabs attention. So one way that I think is a really good way, and you know, it's backed by a lot of research, is that emotional memories actually help us encode things a lot better. It doesn't necessarily improve the accuracy of recall, but it does improve the chances of something being encoded. And right now, that's what we're focusing on. Later in recall, which is a whole other process that's like bringing the information out into the world instead of taking the outside world information and putting it in your brain. So we're not going to deal with that. Right now, we're just focused on encoding. So let's say this car was speeding down the highway, right? And then it ran into a telephone pole, right? And here's the light here, so it's shining. But then all of a sudden, boom, it smashes and there's a huge wreck and the engine explodes. Now there's fire everywhere. The whole car's on fire. You hear the word boom and crash. And now there's gasoline spilling out onto the pavement here. And you smell the smoke and the gasoline, which doesn't, well, some people think it smells nice. I don't think it smells nice. So now you have sound. You have visual imagery, so visual. You also have smell. If you were to, you know, smell is pretty similar to taste. Taste is kind of hard to get. So I don't really recommend doing that. You can also like add a flavor while you're trying to memorize this. I know some people put like lemon drops on their tongue or like eat mustard. I just think that's ridiculous, and it's really not going to help you that much more. So like, it's just much easier to do visual encoding. But let's say, okay, sound, smell, and visual, right? This is a pretty vivid image, right? If this car was speeding down the highway and smashed into a phone pole and exploded, right? You're thinking, oh my gosh, like, is that person okay? How's the car? How big was the wreck? Like, oh, I can hear the smash and now the fire and the explosion of the car. Right now it goes boom, it explodes, and now I can also smell the gasoline and the smoke, right? That's a lot more senses, and it's going to be way easier to remember if you were to just think of this instead of these three words, right? This is much easier to remember, and so you can actually just take each one. Like you could do this for chloroplast too, and it's going to help you remember it a lot easier. And another thing just to note when you're making notes like this is that when you're asked to recall this information and say write about it, you can just go from the topic to the type to the details. And that's your argumentative essay. If it's saying like compare and contrast the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, right? Now you can just say, well, the mitochondria has these two aspects. The chloroplasts, right, this is organelle 2, has these three aspects. And this one is like, in all cells, and this one's in animal cells, right? All you have to do is just go out from your center topic. And you can do this with anything that makes it super easy. So that's why I recommend that when you take notes, so fill in all of the gaps that the professor has said, and then to make it easier for yourself to review afterwards, after lecture, and you can write this while you're in lecture too, so you don't forget any details. Just ask the questions that are going to give you, or that the slides will answer. And it will make it very easy for you to know what the slide is talking about. And it will also help you practice for your exam. Because one thing that I really recommend you do is, or one thing that I believe also, is that it doesn't make sense to study in any other way than you will be tested. Because if you're assessed on answering questions, there's no point in training your ability to reread notes or rewatch lectures. One, those are very passive ways of studying, but also, you're not training the skill that the test is going to be assessing, right? And so this is a form of active recall. Let's write that down. This is active recall. And with active recall, you have to, that was the other pathway that we're talking about, so we just talked about encoding down here. But for the recall, you have to draw it from your mind and put it out into the world onto that piece of paper, because you can have the best mental framework in the world. You might have reread your notes and rewatched all of the lectures, and you just know your stuff. But if you've never trained the retrieval process, then it's not, nobody's going to know, because you can't get it out. You can't explain it. So you have to practice explaining it. And you have to practice, answering the questions, because that's your ability to take tests. So that is how I would recommend taking notes. I'm going to take a short break because my throat is kind of hurting from talking so much. And then I will be back in 5 minutes. Letters of recommendation for grad school. This one, I think, is pretty straightforward. I think most of the time you just need to build a good relationship with your professor. By the way, the person who asked this says, do you have any videos on how to get good letters of recommendation for grad school, med school specifically? Yeah, pretty much I would just recommend that you have a really good relationship with your professor, get to know them, talk to them after class, talk to them before class, go to their office hours, really just treat them like human beings, because honestly, I think one thing that people don't realize is that your professors are literally just human beings, and they have their own quirks and biases and, funny jokes and all of that. So literally just treat them like a normal person, and build that relationship. And you also need to have something that is worthwhile. You have to be someone to have somebody recommend you. You have to have something special about you. So that's pretty much my advice, is just, get to know your professors and then have something worth them recommending. So let's move on to apps and software to boost productivity. What was the question for this? I think it was, okay, most people in my year, including myself, are going to uni this week or the next week. I think a video going over the essentials for apps software to revise and take notes effectively would be useful. Okay. I would not recommend that you use software to take notes. I just think that they're not sophisticated enough, especially if you're going to be doing all of, especially if you're going to be doing, all of this and all of this, right? There's just like not the softwares that are out there. I have tried a lot of them, and they are not sophisticated enough. But there are also a couple things that I would recommend. So number one, Anki, which I talked about right here. Anki is a free software that essentially allows you to create your own digital flashcards, so you can type them. That's how I make them fast enough to do it in class. And then you can also study them without having to think about what to study and when. And the reason for that is because it has a built-in algorithm that essentially just tells you what to study and when, and then you don't have to think about it, and it's free. So I don't see any downside. You can log in on like any device and just continue from where you left off. So literally all I do is just, back. So literally all I do is just like to save a lot of time, I'll just study while I'm on the bike. I have like I'll draw this for you real quick, but like imagine that this is like the stationary bike, right? And the seats here, and handlebars are like here. I have an arm that connects to my iPad, and then on this handle here, I have a remote control. So I'm over here, like pedaling. Okay, this is like super hard to draw, but like, this would be me. I'm looking at the screen, and I'm clicking this remote so that I can do flashcards and study at the same time. It just makes it like, super easy. Another software I would recommend, obviously, like the rise of AI, people are like, oh, well, what's the best AI? Is there a really good AI for like taking notes, for summarizing lectures, for having a bunch of assignments, like make it easier? One, don't cheat, obviously, but if there are ways to use them, I would recommend that you use them as long as it's not considered an academic offense. A lot of classes nowadays, a lot of my classes, they actually, they will allow you to use AI to do projects as long as you tell them what you use the AI for. And it's actually quite funny because I think at some point in the future, they're no longer going to be worried about people using AI. I think that they're going to start having people, I think one thing that would be really cool to see is that if you had an exam and they're just like, bring your own essay to the exam, make it the best possible essay you can bring, everybody brings it in, and then what happens? Oh, surprise, now you have to write an essay about what's wrong with that essay that you used AI to write. I think that would be incredibly cool. But in terms of like using AI for projects, there's a bunch of things that you can do. First of all, you can use it to help you plan the brainstorming phase. If you're allowed to, you can have it find you sources. Just make sure, for the love of God, that you actually go and click the link and paste it into Google and see that it is a real source, because AI hallucinates a lot. And never, ever, ever use it to format your sources, because this is actually like horrible. And then, so the main AI that I use for pretty much everything, honestly, is Gemini. And one of my favorite ways to use it is by talking to it when I'm trying to explain concepts. So I'll pretty much just use the chat function, and I'll be like, okay, I'm going to try to explain this like XYZ. I actually have like a full video of me doing this live on my YouTube channel. I think it's like, watch me memorize a 3-hour lecture in 20 minutes or something like that. And I also have a full video on how to use AI in ways that aren't cheating. But for now, I pretty much just use the chat function. And it will tell me exactly what I've said that's wrong, and I'll just do it over and over and over again until I can quantify like, so the way that I quantify that I can't get something wrong is that if I get it right 3 times in a row for 3 days in a row, and then after that I can do it every third day. So it's something that I call the 3 threes. So I can do it every third day until the exam. And at that point, you pretty much can't get it wrong. So yeah, that's the second one that I would write. So Anki, Google Gemini, if you're allowed to, and for the things that you're allowed to use it for. And then honestly, for calendars and to-do lists, all I use is my notes app. I literally just write down what I have to do and then delete it as I go, because I think it's, you know, kind of overkill. Like, I guess if you have events or things, you could use Google Calendar. I don't even use Google Calendar. I literally just write it down in my reminders app on my phone. Those are pretty much the only 2 things that I use. And then obviously the really popular ones of like, you know, Google Sheets or Excel or that sort of thing. Definitely become competent in Excel. It's actually really easy to become competent now, because you can just ask AI, like Google Gemini, and Google Gemini actually plugs into Google Sheets now to just do things for you, and you don't even have to know how to do it. So I think you'd be a fool to not use the tools at your disposal. So that's what I would recommend as like the foundation for the apps that you'd use. I get approached by a lot of different like companies that have new AIs that are, you know, gonna shatter the world supposedly. And honestly, some of them are okay, but I just don't think that they're useful enough that I would actually ever really use them. So I don't really ever promote them, because I don't think that it's, you know, worth your time hearing me talk about it. But anything that I do promote or say on either a live stream or a video or my Instagram or story or literally anything like that, I'm never going to say anything that I haven't, one, either personally used, so I can't speak for it, or 2, don't think is worthwhile just to, you know, get some brand deal. I think that's, you know, ridiculous. I basically want to build trust and be the brand that people would come to, for people to be like, oh, is this like I want somebody that I can actually trust. So that's why I'm here. That's pretty much why I started everything, because I didn't have that advice when I was first starting out. Like, it didn't really exist, especially for people with ADHD. So for all of you who don't know, I have ADHD, and it has just made school like way harder. So I had to find a way to deal with that, and then also find a really efficient study method. And that's also covered in another video. I think it's probably one of my most popular videos. So if you want to know like a more broad outline of the way that I study, I would go check that out. I think I'm just like standing in front of a whiteboard. It's a recording of a live lecture that I gave. So yeah, I would go watch that. Let me look at the chat here, because I think you guys also have a couple of questions. Ask, how do we create a big picture while studying? There's a lot of talk about connecting one topic to another, creating a big picture. So I'm in trouble doing that. I'm lost. Yeah. So I would recommend going to watch the video on my YouTube channel, but I can give you kind of the very basic breakdown here. So first, there's something that I call the pre-grade framework, and each one stands for something. So each part of this acronym is pre-grade. G-R-A-D-E. Okay. This stands for prepare and prime. This stands for reading. This is this is engage in lecture. This is generate flashcards. Oh, this is not good. I forgot the second R's. Oh, review daily, obviously. Arrange visually. And I'll explain what each of these mean in just a second. Drill content. And then exam prep. And this is like a whole other thing that I'm just like not even going to touch on in this live stream. But yeah, so this is like my broad picture. In terms of like finding a way to study, I wanted one that worked for every class, that I could pretty much emphasize different parts depending on the types of classes. So the types of classes that I found, there's memorization based, there's practice and application based, and then there's creative courses, which I actually don't take a lot of. I take a lot of memorization based courses now in psych, but I used to be in biochemistry and molecular genetics, and in that we did, it was like all practice and application. It was just like absolutely ridiculous. So yeah. Pretty much, if you have a memorization-based courses, you weight this way heavier, so memorization. And then for, if you have practice and application, you would have arranged visually weighted more, so practice and application. And application. So prepare and prime here, this one is essentially your mental priming before lecture and your preparation for lecture. A lot of people think that the studying comes after lecture, but it actually starts way before. You're missing a huge step if you don't do that. And then reading, I actually would write this as speed reading. And I've gotten so much hate for this in the comments on the viral video of me explaining this the first time, but yes, speed reading works. Like, I have ADHD. Yes, it works for people with ADHD. I was reading about one page every 3 minutes, and now I read roughly 3 pages per minute, so like 9 times faster. And then if I am really pushing the pace, I could probably do 1 page every like 12 seconds, depending on the difficulty of the book. And you would think that you lose a lot of details and a lot of the understanding, but what I found is that it's actually, I take in and retain a lot more information because you're using the principles of mental priming. So you're reading the first and last sentence of the chapter, you're reading the front and the back of the book, you're reading the first chapter and the last chapter, so you, again, are building that foundation so you know where to put the information of the book. I wouldn't recommend doing this for, things like if you're just reading for fun, right? Because you want to have that experience of not knowing the ending, right? But like for academic things, I find it's just much faster to do it this way. And I do retain a lot more information. I don't get bogged down by the details. And the goal also of reading class papers and that sort of thing is to know how it relates to the class. So all you really want to do is pull out the details that relate to the class. You don't need to get everything. Then engage in lecture. That was pretty much everything I talked about here. All of this note-taking, that's pretty much this first E here. And then generate flashcards. I talked about that with Anki. If you want to know how to do that, I have the full video series that walks through a ton of examples on my website that I would recommend watching that. It's literally everything that I ever do with a ton of examples. I even made my own lectures just to show you how to do it. Then reviewing daily, so that's pretty much the frequency that you do this, but it's also with the algorithm of Anki. So Anki algorithm, and arrange visually. Let's create mind maps. I showed you very basic format of making a mind map, but there's a lot more to that. And then drilling the content. So that's how you would do it. That's dependent on the type of course, obviously, but that would be something like either the chat function of Gemini or memorizing the mind maps, or flashcards. Oh, I can't even read my handwriting. Cards. And I would even put, depending on how you phrase your flashcards, this could be practice questions as well. Practice questions, practice cues. So that also comes into the exam prep, except for the exam prep, you're also going to do a couple other things, which is to make your own full-length practice exams. And then also do something that I call the mistake review. Mistake review. And there's a very strict format that I adhere to for every question that I get wrong on these practice exams, just to make sure that I 100% will get it right on the actual test. And then, again, can't get it wrong. A subcomponent of that would be the 3 threes. But also there's mistake review log. So that's something that I'm not going to cover here, but I cover that in other videos, or I will in the future. Okay, I hope that answers your question about the big picture study. In terms of connecting one topic to another, I would just do that with mind mapping. It's going to be much easier. And again, you can see the overlapping details. If there were overlapping details, like let's say mitochondria had one here, and then it was also like there also, so mitochondria is M in all cells. That would be a way to see how they connect. Do I ever use the Pomodoro timer? I do a different way of Pomodoro. So a lot of people, the common way is the 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. But I find that, especially, so I've done a lot of research in flow and positive psychology. So flow is essentially the state of consciousness where work seems effortless, things are easy. Like if you've ever just been so locked in, so to speak, right? And then you wake up or a couple hours later, you're like, oh, I just got all that work done, and like that was pretty easy. Oh, okay, I'm done. Sweet. Like that's flow state, right? And it takes a while. So let me draw a little diagram here. If any of you have watched any of my previous videos, then you'll probably know what the flow cycle is. But in terms of just a general example here, the flow cycle, it starts with something called the struggle phase. And that can last anywhere from like 5 to 15 minutes, roughly, depending on how often you practice getting in flow. And then after that, it's the transition phase. And this is where you shift into flow. And then you have the recovery phase. Recovery phase. Okay, so the struggle phase, the reason I don't like the typical Pomodoro time intervals is because you can see that if it were to take me 15 minutes to get into flow, I'm only in flow for 10 minutes, which really doesn't make like a huge impact on the amount of work that I want to be. I want to be in flow for as long as possible. So what I found that really works for me, and obviously when you're first starting out, you can't concentrate for that long and you need to build up the skill. You literally don't have the capacity, like your brain, it has synaptic connections, so connections between neurons, and the more you do something, the more connections are made in that area, so you become more efficient and the pathways become stronger. And if you don't practice getting into flow a lot, then you don't have as many synaptic connections, and the neurotransmitters, the signals between the neurons, they get depleted faster. You don't have as many. So the more you do it, essentially, the better you get. So when I first started, I could probably focus for like 10 minutes. Like I would sit in the library for like 8 hours and get like maybe 2 hours of work done, just because my ADHD was so bad. And then I figured out how to do flow, and now I can study for like 14, sometimes even like 16 hours if I'm really pushing it. Not necessarily that that's like all in flow, but I can focus for that long if I need to. I don't ever need to study that long. I study roughly 2 hours a day across all 5 of my classes. But yeah, so my timing intervals are 90 minutes, and then I'll usually do 30-minute rest, and I'll do that times 3 per day. So usually I'll do like 2 in the morning, and then 1 in the evening. And if you want an idea of what my day looks like, so I'll probably have morning practice, and then I'll have this here, and then I'll have class, and then I'll do this, kind of reviewing what the class was that day. And then after that, I'll have another practice, because as rowers, we hate ourselves for some reason and train twice a day. And then after that, because I'm so exhausted, I'll do not deep work. So deep, not deep work. Shallow work, I guess. Funny thing is that deep work is actually not defined. There is no clear definition of what deep work is. But yeah, it's like a whole problem with like one of the frameworks that somebody came up with is that like it really didn't exist. So they had to, I think they have made a definition now, but like it didn't before. So yeah, that's all the shallow work, the meaningless tasks, doing my laundry, folding my laundry, vacuuming, that sort of thing, like, or even just like doing a couple readings. Like I don't really need to be in like deep flow for readings. I can kind of just be like chilling. But like if I'm making flashcards, you need to make them right the first time, because if you make bad flashcards, then you're going to be studying. If you make garbage, you're going to be studying garbage, and then you're going to test like garbage. So you need to make them really good the first time, front load all of the work so that it's really easy by the time finals roll around. For instance, it has been, let's see, classes ended on Thursday, and as of 2 days ago, today Monday, so Saturday, I had learned, made flashcards for, and memorized all of the lecture information, and I don't have my first final for just under 2 weeks. So I pretty much just get to review. No project, no nothing. I just review flashcards that I've already memorized, and it's very easy. I'll do a couple practice tests, but otherwise, I'm chilling, and I have time to do this for all of you. Okay, next question. From our timer, okay, we did that. Paying attention to mistakes. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things. So, the comment I personally like drilling the content advice and paying attention to mistakes. I would highly recommend, just like if you remember nothing else from this entire live stream, reviewing your mistakes is like the biggest thing you could possibly do. One, because it takes off all of the pressure of getting things right, being a perfectionist the first time. But two, this is how your brain works. So you have input, and then it basically works like a machine. So then you have the processing. Then your brain creates the output. And then you have to determine whether the output is correct or not, so scoring. If it's not correct, then you have to go back and adjust the processing so that the input then produces the correct response. And if you think about intelligence, it's more so a matter of speed. It's how quickly can you change your behavior in response to the same stimulus, and how long can you wait from the stimulus and the consequence to be able to determine that it was a consequence of the thing that you did. So it's how long can you wait and how quickly can you change your behavior. And if you don't have the analysis here, the scoring, and then go back and change it so you don't actually redo the problems that you were doing before, right? So if you do a problem and you get it wrong, you need to go back and do it again. to make sure that you actually can get it right. And then you need to do that 3 times in a row, so you do the 3 threes that I was talking about earlier. But one thing that I really like to do is, if I'm practicing questions, I'll just practice with the first question that the professor gave in class. Because they already gave me the answer, so I first need to make sure that I can replicate, and then I can go try new things, and then I can create my own things. So yes, very, very good point. Yeah. Okay. This live stream is now getting a little bit long, so I'm going to end it here. But I will also chop this up into smaller clips and then post them so that you guys can rewatch them, and so that you can replicate and then iterate.